that perhaps that which our ancestors feared is still with us in some way, is still resonant with us, is still waiting in the shadow. Consider, in the closing decades of the 19th century, citizens of London had their imaginations caught fire by a series of murders in the Whitechapel district. In modern parlance, we would call Whitechapel a ghetto. It is a place where the poor are sent in order to be poor, effectively to keep them poor, but most importantly, to keep them out of the mingling and sight of well-to-do society. Think about the parallels today, where we have, where we just taken as a given that our impoverished neighborhoods are going to be sites of ever-unfolding violence. Very much the same. So why is an entire nation's imagination caught fire by the fact that a few impoverished people come to a very messy end? Today, we take such stories as given. We don't even bother to report them on the news. But this series of murders was so resonant with a cultural imagination that we tell stories about it today. And while reports of witnesses conflicted on virtually every imaginable point, was he carrying a weapon? Was he not carrying a weapon? Was he tall? Was he short? Was he thin? Was he fat? Was his clothing dark? Was his clothing light? Did he wear a long coat or did he wear a waistcoat? Conflicted on virtually every point, but there was not a moment of doubt. There was not a moment of doubt in the imagination of every Englishman in the latter 19th century that whoever had committed these crimes, his proper name was Jack. I'm speaking, of course, of Jack the Ripper. But why Jack? Why did they name him Jack? Why was it right for him to be named Jack? Well, in truth, there was no proper name. There was no proper name for a mysterious stranger who stalked the shadows and preyed upon the supple flesh of women but Jack. Because whether they were conscious of it or not, the people living in Whitechapel, the people living in London, the people living in the rest of Europe had already heard stories about Jack. They were already familiar with the figure of Jack. Jack the Ripper was not a new story. It was a terrible confirmation that stories that they had half forgotten might, in point of fact, be true. Because better than 200 years before Jack the Ripper stalked the alleys of Whitechapel, people living throughout London would spend a penny to buy a pulp stock printed publication elaborating the stories and the dreadful adventures of a different urban ghoul, a different urban monster. He wore a long waistcoat to cover the fact that his legs were not entirely human, and with those inhuman legs, which may have been hooved or may have been booted, depending on the story, he could propel himself from rooftop to rooftop, the better to stalk his prey unseen. This was a monster that lived on the chimney tops, on the soot-covered roofs of London. This was a monster who occupied the same space as the chimney sweeps of Mary Poppins, chim chimney, chim chimney. Except his motives were more direct. His motives were more intense. This gentleman went by the name of Spring-Heeled Jack, and he was the most popular figure of the Penny Dreadful for the entire run of that literary genre. We would call the modern equivalent a comic book, although the Penny Dreadfuls were almost predominantly concerned with tales of high adventure, piracy, kidnapping, Robert Louis Stevenson's kind of stuff, but also with stories of dread, of horror, and the most popular figure of that genre was Spring-Heeled Jack. The keenest, the most distinguishing of his features, which really set him apart as a figure, in urban folklore were his fingers. You see, Spring-Heeled Jack was not necessarily malicious. He was not necessarily a malicious figure. We can attribute malice to him for his mutilation of the innocent, for his mutilation of the beautiful, for his mutilation of our friends and neighbors. But that is not necessarily so. You see, Spring-Heeled Jack's fingers were iron razors. Long, sharp iron razors. We cannot entirely know whether he intended to mutilate his victims. For all we know, Jack may have been simply a great lover of women. He loves their softness. He loves their curves. He loves the suppleness of their flesh, and he can't help that his fingers are so sharp. But Jack was not only resonant, was not only reiterated in the Ripper variety. Jack came with the Englishmen when they moved to the New World. Stories of Jack came and found a new form in the story of the Jersey Devil. Very, very early in the colonial period of North America, there were stories told around hearth fires about a figure very much like our familiar Spring-Heeled Jack. A gentleman in a long coat, perhaps even a top hat, with long back-kneed legs like a goat or a deer, that allowed him to leap great distances from place to place, leaving scorch marks in the snow wherever he set foot, and leaving neatly scissored, neatly butchered any hapless enough to encounter him in his wanderings. And here we find a very curious parallel, because Spring-Heeled Jack, come the Jersey Devil, already had a relative living on the North American continent. A thing like a man with legs like a goat, leaving scorched trails of fire as he runs through the sky, with fingers cold, sharp, and terrible, claws like icicles that freeze the heart even as he slices it from your chest for the crime of wandering a little bit too far away from the fire.